What's a history fact that just gets you choked up every time you have to tell it?
While it's impossible to know for certain, the estimates for the Indigenous population of Victoria prior to any European settlement on the Australian continent were between 60 and 70,000 people. By the time European settlement started in Victoria in earnest in 1835, the population had been reduced to about 12,000 people by diseases like smallpox and typhus that had arrived from Sydney. The colonial expansion in Victoria is almost unique on the world stage for how quickly and violently the land was taken over. By 1855, after just 20 years, the population of the colony had exceeded 300,000 people, and it is estimated that there were only 1,000 Indigenous people left. The loss of life was so galling that humanitarians at the time applied pressure to the Victorian government to attempt to intervene. This pressure was successful, and the Victorian legislature passed the Aboriginal Protectorate Act in the 1860s, establishing the Board for the Protection of Aborigines. The stated goal of this legislation and this Protectorate Board was to prevent the extinction of Indigenous people in the colony of Victoria. They oversaw missions and established the first government-run stations for Indigenous people. The legislation, however, was highly paternalistic. The board had the right to dictate where Indigenous people could work, who they could marry, and in many instances, wages were paid not to Aboriginal people, but to the board, which would then distribute those wages, or more often, fail to distribute those wages. By the 1880s, the project of maintaining these stations was becoming too expensive, and the land that some of them were run on was looking too valuable. The board had changed hands, and the new members had decided that really the stations were there to provide a soft pillow for the full-blooded Indigenous people for them to die on, and that what they should really do to be responsible would be to remove the half-castes or Indigenous people of mixed descent from the stations and attempt to integrate them into white society, to assimilate them, since the extinction of all Indigenous people was a foregone conclusion. This legislative framework for the Protectorate Board was adopted by every other colony or state. In 1888, the Victorian Parliament passed the Half-Caste Act, which was the first legislative legal distinction between a full-blooded Indigenous person and a person of mixed descent, a half-caste. The Act itself gave the board permission to evict Indigenous people of mixed descent from all of the stations and missions that it oversaw, and the legal distinction was then adopted by every other colony and state. And so, the mechanism that white Australia concocted to attempt to stem the tide of destruction against Indigenous people in this country became a tool to further that genocide.